When we speak about understanding an avoidant heart, we must begin with a simple but uncomfortable truth. Distance is rarely about you. It is usually about a pattern formed long before you arrived. Many people misinterpret avoidance as lack of feeling, yet in reality it is often a strategy for emotional survival. At some point in their life, closeness may have felt overwhelming, unpredictable, or unsafe. So they learn to regulate themselves through withdrawal. If you chase that withdrawal with urgency, you unknowingly confirm their belief that intimacy brings pressure. The first shift, therefore, is internal. Instead of reacting to their distance with panic, you respond with observation. You ask yourself what is truly happening beneath the surface. You realize that their silence is not necessarily rejection, but regulation. This awareness immediately changes your energy. You stop personalizing every pause. You stop trying to decode every delayed message as proof of your inadequacy. Calm understanding becomes your strength. And that calm is powerful because it removes the emotional intensity that often feeds the avoidant cycle. Once you stop personalizing their defenses, you regain your balance. This balance is not indifference. It is grounded perception. You recognize that you cannot force someone to feel safe. Safety is experienced, not argued into existence. When you approach them without accusation, without dramatic ultimatums, and without constant emotional pursuit, you create a different atmosphere. They begin to sense that you are not trying to invade their autonomy. Instead, you are standing in your own. This subtle shift can be deeply disarming. An avoidant person expects either demand or withdrawal in anger. When they encounter steadiness instead, it disrupts their expectation. Your composure becomes a mirror. It reflects the difference between their internal tension and your external calm. In that mirror, they may slowly begin to question whether their distance is still necessary. Understanding also protects you from self-abandonment. Many people lose themselves trying to win reassurance from someone emotionally distant, but awareness helps you maintain perspective. You see the pattern without absorbing it. You can care without clinging. You can communicate without pleading. And when you do express your needs, you do so from clarity rather than fear. This grounded stance signals quiet confidence. It shows that your worth is not hanging on their response. Paradoxically, this is often the moment when realization begins to stir. When you are no longer fighting their defenses, they are left alone with them, and sometimes that silence speaks louder than any argument ever could. Emotional self-sufficiency is not about becoming distant or pretending you do not care. It is about learning to hold your own inner world without making another person responsible for stabilizing it. When you are connected to someone with avoidant tendencies, one of the hidden fears they carry is the fear of being overwhelmed by another's emotional needs. They may worry that closeness will require them to constantly reassure, constantly fix, constantly merge. If you approach them from a place of anxiety, seeking constant validation, their instinct will be to retreat. Not because you are unworthy, but because their nervous system interprets intensity as threat. Emotional self-sufficiency changes this dynamic at its root. You learn to soothe your own fears before bringing them into conversation. You reflect before reacting. You allow feelings to pass through you without demanding immediate resolution. This creates a steady emotional rhythm, and that rhythm feels safer to someone who fears emotional chaos. As you cultivate this inner steadiness, something subtle begins to shift. You are no longer interacting from a state of emotional hunger. You are interacting from wholeness. You still have needs, but you express them clearly and calmly. You no longer test them to see if they care. You no longer dramatize distance to provoke reassurance. Instead, you speak directly. You say what you feel without exaggeration and without accusation. This directness reduces pressure. It communicates maturity. An avoidant person may not immediately respond with openness, but they will notice the difference. They will sense that you are not trying to bind them through emotional dependency. You are standing beside them, not leaning on them. That distinction matters deeply. It challenges their belief that intimacy equals loss of freedom. Emotional self-sufficiency also strengthens your own position. You begin to build a life that is rich beyond the relationship. You invest in friendships, goals, personal growth, and spiritual depth. Your happiness is no longer suspended on their consistency. When they pull away, you do not collapse. You continue living. This continuity can quietly awaken awareness in them. They may begin to realize that your presence is a choice, not a necessity. And when someone realizes they are chosen rather than needed for survival, respect grows. Realization of your worth often begins when you demonstrate that you can stand firmly on your own ground, not in defiance, but in dignity. Consistency without over-pursuit is a discipline of emotional balance. When you are connected to someone who leans toward avoidance, extremes often intensify the pattern. If you become unpredictable, they feel confirmed in their distrust. If you become overly persistent, they feel pressured and instinctively retreat. The middle path requires strength. You show up when you say you will. You respond with warmth, but not urgency. You communicate interest, but you do not chase reassurance. This steadiness creates a rhythm that is neither suffocating nor cold. Many people underestimate the power of predictability. For an avoidant person, inconsistency often shaped their early understanding of closeness. When you remain reliable without becoming intrusive, you offer a new experience. You become associated with calm rather than chaos. Over time, this association begins to soften defensive reflexes. At the same time, consistency does not mean over-availability. There is a difference between being present and being constantly accessible. Over-pursuit can look like repeated messages when there is no response, constant attempts to define the relationship, or adjusting your schedule entirely around theirs. These actions may seem loving on the surface, but they often communicate anxiety beneath. An avoidant individual senses this intensity and interprets it as pressure. Instead, you allow natural pauses. You trust that if they wish to engage, they will. You maintain your own structure, your own routines, your own priorities. This quiet self-containment changes the energy of the connection. They are no longer being pulled toward you. They are invited toward you. And invitations feel safer than demands. Over time, this balanced consistency becomes a mirror. They notice that you are stable even when they fluctuate. When they step back, you do not react dramatically. When they step forward, you welcome them without resentment. This steadiness highlights the contrast between your grounded approach and their defensive habits. Awareness often grows in contrast. They may begin to realize that your presence brings stability to their life. They may notice that you do not create emotional storms. Realization is rarely sparked by argument. It grows quietly in repeated experiences. When someone consistently encounters warmth without pressure, reliability without control, they begin to reconsider their old beliefs about intimacy. And in that reconsideration, your worth becomes more visible than ever. Boundary clarity is not an act of rebellion. It is an act of self-recognition. When you are involved with someone who withdraws from emotional depth, it can be tempting to lower your standards in order to keep them close. You may tell yourself that patience alone will solve everything. You may accept inconsistent communication, postponed plans, or emotional unavailability in the hope that understanding will eventually transform them. Yet every time you tolerate less than you truly need, you quietly teach them that minimal effort is sufficient. Clear boundaries interrupt this pattern. They are not dramatic ultimatums delivered in anger. They are calm statements of what you require in order to feel respected. You communicate your expectations without accusation. You explain what consistency, honesty, and effort mean to you. And then, most importantly, you align your actions with those words. This alignment is what gives boundaries their power. When boundaries are expressed calmly, they do not attack the other person's autonomy. They simply define your own. An avoidant individual may initially feel discomfort. Boundaries challenge their comfort zone because they introduce accountability. Yet discomfort is not the same as rejection. In fact, clear boundaries can create unexpected safety. They remove ambiguity. They show that you are aware of your own worth and unwilling to abandon yourself to maintain connection. This steadiness can be quietly impactful. Instead of chasing their attention, you demonstrate that your presence is contingent upon mutual respect. If communication fades, you reduce your investment rather than escalating your demands. If promises are repeatedly broken, you step back with composure instead of pleading for change. This response often carries more psychological weight than emotional confrontation ever could. Over time, boundary clarity shifts the dynamic. The avoidant person begins to realize that access to you is not automatic. It is earned through reciprocity. They may reflect on the difference between losing control and losing connection. Your willingness to walk away from what diminishes you does not signal coldness. It signals dignity. And dignity has a way of commanding respect without raising its voice. When you stand firmly in what you need, you create a clear contrast between healthy connection and emotional distance. In that contrast, realization can emerge. They may begin to see that your steadiness, your clarity, and your restraint are not threats to their freedom, but invitations to a more balanced form of closeness. Emotional maturity in conflict is one of the most transformative forces in any connection, especially with someone who tends to withdraw. Conflict is often the moment when avoidance intensifies. Raised voices, accusations, or desperate attempts to force clarity can activate their deepest defenses. To respond differently requires restraint and awareness. When tension arises, you pause before reacting. You notice your own surge of emotion and allow it to settle enough for clarity to emerge. Instead of saying, "You never care," you express, "I feel distant when communication drops suddenly." This subtle shift changes the entire atmosphere. You are no longer attacking their character. You are revealing your internal experience. Emotional maturity does not suppress feeling. It refines its expression. It replaces blame with articulation. For an avoidant individual, this distinction matters deeply because it reduces the instinct to defend and creates room for dialogue. Calm articulation also challenges their internal narrative about intimacy. Many avoidant patterns are built on the belief that closeness leads to chaos or loss of control. If every disagreement confirms that belief, they retreat further into distance. But when you handle disagreement with steadiness, you offer new evidence. You demonstrate that tension can exist without destruction. You allow pauses in conversation without interpreting them as abandonment. You respect space when it is requested, yet you return to the discussion when both are grounded. This rhythm teaches emotional safety through experience rather than persuasion. Over time, repeated experiences of calm conflict begin to soften rigid defenses. They may not admit it immediately, but internally they register that vulnerability with you does not spiral into emotional overwhelm. Emotional maturity also protects your own dignity. Instead of escalating to gain attention, you remain centered. You refuse to chase resolution through dramatic gestures. If communication temporarily stops, you do not flood them with messages. You trust your ability to address issues when the time is appropriate. This self-control communicates confidence. It shows that you value constructive conversation more than immediate validation. When an avoidant person encounters someone who can disagree without hostility and express pain without manipulation, it disrupts their expectations. In that disruption, awareness often grows. They begin to see that connection with you does not threaten their independence. It offers stability. And stability, experienced repeatedly in moments of tension, becomes one of the strongest reminders of your worth. Strategic space is often misunderstood as withdrawal or emotional punishment, yet in its healthiest form, it is neither. It is the conscious decision to stop overextending your energy in places where it is not being met. When dealing with someone who tends to avoid closeness, constant availability can unintentionally protect them from experiencing the consequences of their distance. If you always initiate contact, always repair disconnection, always bridge silence, they never fully feel your absence. Strategic space shifts that rhythm. You step back, not in anger, but in self-respect. You allow conversations to breathe. You allow them to initiate. This pause is not a game. It is an act of restoring balance. In that balance, you stop carrying the emotional weight alone. And when the emotional labor is no longer one-sided, awareness has room to surface. Creating space also requires inner discipline. The urge to reach out during silence can be strong, especially if uncertainty triggers anxiety. Yet each time you resist acting from fear, you strengthen your own emotional stability. You remind yourself that connection must be mutual to be sustainable. By not rushing to fill every gap, you communicate something powerful without speaking. You signal that your time and energy are valuable. An avoidant person may initially feel relief in the quiet, but over time, something else often appears. They may notice the difference in frequency. They may sense that your warmth is not as readily available. Absence, when calm and intentional, can illuminate value more clearly than constant presence ever could. Strategic space also invites reflection on both sides. It gives them the opportunity to feel curiosity, longing, or even concern. These emotions cannot arise if you are always compensating for their withdrawal. When they experience a shift in your availability, they may begin to question their own patterns. They may ask themselves why the connection feels different. This internal questioning is where realization often begins. You are no longer persuading them of your worth. You are allowing them to experience life without your constant reassurance. If they move toward you, it is from choice rather than pressure. If they remain distant, you gain clarity about the limits of the bond. Either way, strategic space restores your dignity and creates the conditions where true awareness can emerge. Self-expansion is one of the quietest, yet most powerful shifts you can make in any relationship dynamic. When you are focused solely on how to make someone recognize your worth, your energy contracts around them. Your thoughts revolve around their responses, their moods, their availability. Over time, this narrow focus drains vitality. Self-expansion reverses that contraction. Instead of centering your growth around the relationship, you return to your own evolution. You invest in your physical well-being, your intellectual curiosity, your creative interests, your spiritual depth. You reconnect with ambitions that may have been placed on hold. This is not an attempt to provoke jealousy. It is a return to alignment with your fuller identity. As you expand, your energy changes. You become less preoccupied with what they are doing and more engaged with who you are becoming. This shift creates a subtle but undeniable contrast. An avoidant individual often feels safest when dynamics remain predictable. If you have been consistently available, consistently accommodating, they may unconsciously assume that pattern will continue. When you begin to grow in visible ways, when your schedule becomes fuller, when your conversations reflect new insight and confidence, the dynamic evolves. They may notice that you are no longer orbiting around them. This realization can be disorienting. Growth carries movement, and movement introduces the possibility of distance, yet it also introduces admiration. There is something naturally compelling about a person who is developing themselves with quiet dedication. Your expansion communicates that your life has meaning beyond the relationship. That meaning commands respect. Self-expansion also strengthens your emotional resilience. As you build competence and fulfillment in multiple areas of life, your sense of identity becomes less fragile. You no longer measure your value by how quickly they respond or how intensely they engage. This inner stability changes how you show up. You speak with greater clarity. You tolerate less inconsistency. You radiate grounded confidence. An avoidant person may begin to sense that the connection is no longer something they can take for granted. They may feel both inspired and challenged by your growth. Realization often awakens when someone recognizes that the person beside them is evolving, and that staying connected requires growth on their part as well. In expanding yourself, you make your worth visible without ever having to argue for it. Acceptance of outcome is the final and most liberating shift in this entire dynamic. It is the moment you release the illusion that you can control another person's awakening. When you are entangled in trying to make someone realize your worth, your energy becomes tense and watchful. You analyze every message, every pause, every subtle change in tone. This constant vigilance quietly drains your dignity. Acceptance interrupts that cycle. It does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop forcing. You recognize that realization cannot be extracted through effort. It must arise from within the other person. When you internalize this truth, something inside you softens. You begin to focus less on triggering awareness in them and more on embodying clarity within yourself. This shift restores calm. You no longer approach the connection as a problem to solve, but as an experience to observe with honesty. With acceptance comes emotional freedom. You understand that your value is not suspended on their ability to see it. If they awaken to your consistency, your growth, your steadiness, then the connection can deepen naturally. If they remain distant despite your balanced efforts, that outcome also carries information. Instead of resisting reality, you allow it to reveal itself. This posture of openness is powerful because it removes hidden agendas. You are no longer adjusting your behavior to produce a specific reaction. You are acting from integrity. An avoidant individual can sense this difference. When they realize you are not clinging to a particular outcome, pressure dissolves. Sometimes, paradoxically, this lack of pressure creates the very space where clarity emerges. Acceptance also anchors you in self-respect. You become willing to walk away from what does not reciprocate your effort. Not dramatically, not with bitterness, but with composure. This composure speaks louder than persuasion ever could. It communicates that you are whole with or without their validation. And that wholeness often prompts reflection. They may begin to ask themselves whether their avoidance is protecting them or costing them something meaningful. Whether they move toward you or remain distant, you remain grounded. In accepting the outcome, you reclaim your authority. The true realization is not only theirs to have, it is yours as well. You realize that your worth has always existed independently of anyone's acknowledgement. Patience with progression is a discipline that few people practice when emotions are involved. When you care deeply, you want clarity quickly. You want reassurance now. Yet when dealing with an avoidant pattern, urgency often backfires. Real change inside another person rarely happens in dramatic breakthroughs. It unfolds in small recognitions that accumulate over time. If you expect immediate transformation, frustration will leak into your tone, your posture, your silence. That subtle pressure can reactivate their instinct to retreat. Patience does not mean tolerating disrespect. It means understanding that psychological defenses soften gradually. When you respond consistently, hold boundaries calmly, and maintain your own growth, you are planting seeds rather than demanding fruit. Seeds require time beneath the surface before anything visible appears. Trusting this process protects your composure and keeps you from sabotaging progress through impatience. Patience also strengthens your discernment. Instead of obsessing over daily fluctuations, you begin observing patterns over weeks and months. You notice whether communication is slowly becoming more open, whether vulnerability is appearing in small increments, whether effort is increasing even if imperfectly. This broader perspective prevents you from reacting to every minor withdrawal as a final verdict. At the same time, patience is not passive blindness. It is attentive awareness. If there is no growth at all, if distance remains rigid despite your balanced approach, patience eventually transforms into clarity. You recognize the difference between slow progress and permanent stagnation. This understanding allows you to make decisions from reason rather than from wounded pride. In practicing patience, you also demonstrate emotional steadiness. An avoidant individual often fears being rushed into emotional depths they are not ready to navigate. When they sense that you're not demanding immediate declarations or dramatic shifts, they may feel less cornered. Feeling uncornered reduces resistance. Over time, they may begin to open in subtle ways because they do not feel forced. Your calm endurance communicates confidence in yourself. It shows that you are not desperate for instant validation, that confidence carries quiet authority. Sometimes realization dawns not because you pushed for it, but because you allowed space for it to emerge naturally. And in allowing that space, you preserve both your dignity and the possibility of genuine, lasting change. Mutual respect is the cornerstone of any meaningful connection, especially with someone who exhibits avoidant tendencies. Respect is not about silence, submission, or tolerating behavior that diminishes your worth. It is about recognizing both your own boundaries and the other person's limits while maintaining honesty and clarity. Many attempts to trigger realization fail because they prioritize outcomes over integrity. When you insist, manipulate, or try to make someone feel your value, you breach mutual respect. True influence arises from holding respect for yourself consistently, even when faced with withdrawal. This consistency signals that your presence is earned and that your energy cannot be taken for granted. An avoidant individual is often sensitive to authenticity. When they sense that respect is genuine, it bypasses their defenses in ways that manipulation never can. Practicing mutual respect involves observing your own reactions and recalibrating them when they are fueled by fear or desire for control. You do not punish withdrawal with coldness, nor do you reward it with over-attention. Instead, you maintain composure and act in alignment with your values. When communication is delayed, you respond with calm clarity rather than anxiety. When promises are broken, you honor your boundaries without dramatics. Over time, this measured approach contrasts with patterns of inconsistency they may have encountered in the past. The avoidant mind begins to notice a new possibility. Connection can exist without pressure, without chaos, and without compromising personal dignity. Respect becomes a mirror, reflecting both your stability and the potential for healthier interaction. Mutual respect also invites reciprocity. When you demonstrate steadiness, integrity, and self-regard, you create conditions where the other person can engage without fear of judgment or coercion. They begin to realize that your presence is not a given. It is contingent upon shared effort and consideration. This realization is subtle but profound. It is not a dramatic awakening. It is the quiet